I just wanted to bring in one more point about this. It's an exercise that I like to mention, sort of a poetic spiritual exercise, which consists of looking in the mirror and asking yourself, what are my true desires? Now, I've often when I suggest this to people, they get very defensive, because I think it's a totally scary thing to do. Usually the little sensor in our mind is working all the time on the unconscious level, and we never permit ourselves to, or very rarely permit ourselves to think about our true desires. Poets are sort of an exception in this case, because poetry and desire are intimately linked, almost inseparable. The desire and the creation of the expression of the desire are almost the same act. So we should have a bit of a head start on most folks in looking in the mirror and asking what are my true desires? Now, I think a lot of people fear that if they do this, some kind of Frankenstein, you know, some kind of a Jekyll and Hyde monster will look back out at them. So, well, my true desire is, you know, serial murder or something. In fact, that's a very fashionable response these days. I don't think so, you know, especially not poets. Poets are certainly on the side of the life force. Makers, creators are on the side of life, not death. So I don't think we need to be too afraid of that. Some people are afraid that they'll discover weird sexual desires when they look in, if they ask this question. And I think that a resistance to discovering those desires is what fuels people like these asshole promise keepers. I think they're probably all closet cases, you know, or at least a great many of the most influential and active of them, probably totally terrified to look in the mirror and face the fact that they're a little bit perverse. You know, as Alan said yesterday, everyone's just a little bit homosexual, whether they like it or not, you know. Or not homosexual, but, you know, a lesbian, or, I don't know, you know, name it. Our society is afraid of it all. Every last thing, even to be, even heterosexuality is scary nowadays. So there's that problem, but again, I don't think that it's one that will scare poets as much as it would some other categories of people, because of the intimate connection between poetry and desire. But these are personal desires, but there's no reason why the utopian desire shouldn't be considered personal. The political is the subjective, political is the personal is the political, on some level. It's not limited to that, but on some level, the subjective and the political flow into each other. In fact, every utopia is really somebody's wet dream, in a sense. Someone's great hidden desire. And in fact, the more out that those desires are in the construction of a utopia, the more interesting I always find it. It's too late to get started talking about Charles Fourier or anybody like that, but I could mention Blake in his Marriage of Heaven and Hell, I believe it was, who talked about the danger of unsatisfied desires. Unsatisfied desires being really the fuel of the furnace of Moloch. I don't know if he used that term, or I probably got it from Alan. The Moloch, of course, the Babylonian god who demanded the sacrifice of the children. And I think that in all the utopian reading that I've done, and which I hope to be able to get around to discussing with you in some detail without monopolizing all the time, it's this unleashing of desire that I find most pleasing and attractive, always the most attractive thing. I mean, someone who's as overtly erotic as Blake asks you to fall in love with him. You know, he asks you to desire his desires, to actually feel sexual excitement over his proposals for society. And I think any good utopia would certainly have that in it, because a utopia without sex is precisely, we're back to Plato again, who, despite the fact that he was queer himself, banned homosexuality in the laws of his republic, because he saw that free sexual expression would remove the kind of repressed energy that was needed to set up such a totalitarian, authoritarian society that he proposed. He also banned the poets, interestingly enough. No queers, no poets in Plato's Republic. So let's say no dissident sexuality, no dissident imagination, no individual sexuality, no individual imagination. And only the group. The group becomes the supreme value. But in the anti-authoritarian or non-authoritarian utopian tradition, there's a much more open and working relationship between the individual and the group. The individual's desires must be satisfied for the group in order to function properly. If the individual is repressed in a poetic utopia, then the society is built on that repression, on the energy of that repression, and therefore will be a repressive society, and therefore we won't be happy, so it won't be utopia, QED. So in our utopias, the individual and the group must have a love affair, a love relationship, an erotic relationship between the individual and the group, which Fourier, for example, went so far as to propose as the orgy. Orgiastic behavior is true utopian behavior, according to him. So we can get into Fourier, hopefully, at some point. A very interesting character. French utopian socialist of the late 18th and early 19th century. Actually, his life overlapped with Blake's. So, or actually the Marquis de Sade is an interesting character to consider in this respect, because he had a kind of dark version of this. A version in itself nasty and repressive, in that his society of libertines would realize its pleasures at the expense of a lot of women and children who would not be full members of that society. So it's scarcely anarchistic or egalitarian, but it is a utopia of desire, and it also arises at about the same period, transition between the 18th and the 19th century, when these ideas began to appear. So Blake, Fourier, and de Sade are very interesting and closely related minds in this respect of the role of passion and desire in constructing a utopia. So I think that if you look in the mirror and say, what are my true desires, you will very soon be out of the realm of the merely personalistic and individual and cut off and alienated, because a lot of our truest desires will most certainly depend on a reordering or restructuring or a revisualization of the group, of society. Because how can the individual accomplish anything truly desirable on its own? Our resources are limited. It's been proven in studies of the so-called wild children who are raised by animals, that there's actually a cutoff point for learning a human language. It occurs at about, if I'm not mistaken, at about age 6 or 7. If you have not learned a human language by that time, you never will. It's because the relationship between the individual and the group that's expressed in language is an actual physiological link of somatic development. The development of the body, actually, is involved in this socialization process. You cannot actually be human without the group. You can't be an individual without a group. It's not an opposition, it's a yin-yang thing. It's not dualism, it's dyadic, it's dynamic. It's a the dynamic duo, as they used to call Batman and Robin, is the individual and society. So individualism versus communalism is a false dichotomy. individualism versus communism is a false dichotomy, small c communism. And it took a long time plowing through a lot of post-medieval ideology to arrive at that discovery, and we still haven't made it. We're still not there. So I guess the last few minutes here we better devote to comments and questions, but we'll just end by asking for a short utopian text that we could use as the basis for our discussion next time. But are there anybody want to continue points that we were talking about before, or ask questions at the last 15 minutes or so? How much is that about what we've got? 15 minutes? Somebody, what's the time?
It's 10 after 12.
Well, I was thinking when you were bringing up Plato, and the interesting thing is that so often when people are talking about the good of the group over this, over this, over this, over this, you really start wondering, I mean, the question is, who is supposed to be receiving this good? Because there's a great list of who is supposed to be sacrificing.
There is no one.
But it's like, who? I mean, everybody is supposed to be sacrificing this amount of themselves and this part of themselves for the good of some sort of, Plato. Maybe.
Platonism or communism is actually is aimed at no one. No one. I'm making a joke. I'm making a joke.
I know, the philosopher king.
There is no one to receive this benefit. It's only the many, and the many, in this sense, is an illusion.
Yeah.
The hydra, it is really the hydra, the many-headed beast that doesn't exist. It's a chimera, a non-existent animal. So without the one, there is no many. Without the Tao gives birth to the two gives birth to the three, and the three gives birth to the 10,000 things. So without the Tao and without the one, there is no many. So this is why ultimately Bolshevism died, because it was not aimed at anyone. It was not for anyone, and no one could feel that it was for them. And hey, eventually you get sick of this shit, and it just evaporated.
Because any alleged benefit is societal, the sacrifice is individual, it's love.
Yeah.
It's like the only time that sacrifice has to be made is when something moves out of media.
Mm-hmm.
And
here we have the myth of the individual, but so that's, I think, why so-called democracy has out-survived communism, just because of that myth. But when people see through the myth, when the myth is seen through by enough ones, that too will go. And then civilization may collapse. And because civilization is so wrapped up in its own libido, its own collective libido, this will be seen as the end of the world, but it won't be.